Part of this video is sponsored by Soundcore. It's a multi-billion-dollar market with over 100,000 stores worldwide. There are world records, cultural festivals, and even theme parks dedicated to it. Love it or hate it, bubble tea has taken the world by storm. And this is not just a trend. It's a culture, an experience, and for many, an obsession. But have you ever stopped to wonder, where did bubble tea suddenly come from? The short answer is just one Google search away. Bubble tea originated on the island nation of Taiwan sometime around the late 1980s. And it truly is a country addicted to the sweet, milky, chewy drink. In fact, its obsession runs so deep that in the past decade, Taiwan saw a heated court case unlike any before it. Two legendary tea houses, Chunshui Tang and Hanlin Chaguan, were in a fierce dispute over who can claim to have originated the global sensation from their humble tea shop. But after a decade-long legal battle, the courts finally delivered their verdict. And it was quite the bombshell. They ruled that bubble tea had already become part of common culture, open for anyone to make and sell, thus making the search for its inventor, and I quote, meaningless. And I love this verdict so much, because after spending weeks in this food history rabbit hole, I agree that the real question here is truly not about who sold the first cup of boba. This is about so much more. It's a tale of cultural identities, global power dynamics, and economic triumph. And in fact, when you deconstruct a classic cup of bubble tea into its core components, the chewy tapioca pearls, the rich black tea, and the velvety smooth milk, you get to an answer that is a lot more interesting and nuanced than I could have ever imagined. The invention of bubble tea wasn't just a fluke, it was inevitable. It's been a while since I said that, but let me explain. Let's start our exploration with the signature component of bubble tea, the bubbles. They're also called boba, which is the Taiwanese name for the large tapioca pearls traditionally added to bubble tea. But desserts with a chewy, bouncy texture are certainly not exclusive to Taiwan. In fact, they're kind of a staple across huge parts of Asia, a texture widely celebrated and known under the mysterious name of QQ. You can find it anywhere, from the Philippines to Vietnam and Japan. And when it comes to the tapioca pearls you commonly find in bubble tea, well, you can trace their lineage directly to the sago pearls of Southeast Asia. Sago pearls themselves are derived from the starch of the sago palm tree. They were traditionally mixed with fruits or starchy dumplings, in syrups or coconut milk, and as technology progressed, atop shaved ice. But there's a little catch, which is that sago palm trees are not super easy to grow. So when during colonial times new foods started becoming available across Asia, people happily started replacing sago with much less expensive but texturally similar tapioca, which is also a starch that is derived from the cassava plant native to South America. This is actually still evident to this day when you check out popular desserts like halo-halo from the Philippines, or cendol in Malaysia, or es doger in Indonesia. These are very often enriched with sago or tapioca bubbles, albeit much smaller than what you'd find in bubble tea these days. These pearls made their way up north to China and Taiwan through Hokkien merchants. Hokkien being a subgroup of Chinese people, to keep it simple. And those tapioca pearls, well, they blended in quite seamlessly into a culture that was already used to and quite enamored with jelly-like desserts made from things like sticky rice flour or mung bean starch. They also became a cherished addition to tong soi, or sweet soups, which is like a category of dessert in southern China. And while these dishes can all be seen as very distant ancestors of bubble tea, we are still quite the long way away, because we are missing another key ingredient. Tea is, of course, a quintessentially Chinese beverage. For hundreds, if not thousands of years, China and its close neighbors were the only places where tea was grown and drunk. But what matters for this story is how tea became a drink cherished around the world. European travelers and traders first started falling in love with the beverage around the 15th or 16th century, and only around 100 years later, it had taken the whole continent of Europe by storm. Especially the British became quite enamored with tea, which quickly rose to become one of the hottest luxury items for the rich and super rich. And this just left one thing to do for a hubristic, rising colonial power. They were not that interested in importing tea from China for tons of money again and again. They wanted to make their own. And the perfect place for that was the island of Ceylon. Today it is known as Sri Lanka and it's an independent country, but back then it was one of the newly conquered colonies of the British Empire, which just happened to have the perfect climate for growing tea. Although we have to note that things went a little different than expected, resulting in a huge difference between Chinese and British tea cultures. You see, Chinese tea in China was being grown for locals and not for export or long shipping routes. It focused on whole leaves with refined flavors and valued characteristics such as location or harvest time, especially for delicate green teas and oolongs. Ceylon tea, on the other hand, was different. Made for export to the faraway British mainland, they specialized in heavily oxidized black tea, which was a lot more resistant to the long journey. They also blended teas from different plantations and chopped it into a fine dust to hide imperfections and fluctuations in quality. The result was a less refined but fuller-bodied, strong black tea, which made a whole new trend possible, adding milk and sugar to this robust brew. An approach as un-Chinese as you can possibly imagine. And yet, the allure of creamy milk tea became popular with the rich and powerful wherever the British Empire reached. Which is finally starting to bring us a little bit closer to bubble tea. Part of this video is sponsored by Soundcore. I love listening to music or podcasts when I'm on the go, but in a busy, noisy world, not just any old pair of headphones will do. And that's why there's something I want to show you today. Soundcore sent me their latest headphones to check out, and that is Space One. And it's not just a sleek looking pair of headphones. Its upgraded powerful noise cancelling structure is especially good at cancelling out voices, like loud chatter or crying babies, perfect if you live in or travel to a big city. But its adaptive noise cancelling technology detects external sounds and auto-calibrates to deliver optimal noise reduction in all sorts of different environments. I tried wearing them for a couple of days, and thanks to their floating axis ear cup design, they will not only fit any head, they also felt really quite comfortable and so much lighter than a lot of other headphones I've tried before. They come at a super fair price as well. Oh, and if you're wondering about sound quality, thanks to LDAC support, Space One offers crisp, high-res audio. If all of that sounds good to you, make sure to check the link in the video description to learn more about Space One. Turn down the crowd wherever you go with Soundcore Space One. Thank you, Soundcore, for sponsoring this video. So let's take a little but very important detour to Hong Kong. Effectively stolen by the British from China in 1842, being a British colony was not immune to the tea with milk trend, despite one major caveat. You see, a big part of the Chinese population tends to be lactose intolerant. So it's not a big surprise that cows and cattle in China were used for agricultural work and meat, but not so much for dairy. What I'm trying to say here is that milk in 19th century Hong Kong was pretty hard to come by. Of course, the British built a few dairy farms to feed their milk tea addiction, but without industrial cooling, fresh raw milk was very hard to keep food safe for more than a few hours, which meant that it was only available at crazy high prices and virtually inaccessible for the majority of Hong Kongers. But then a new and crucial innovation came around. Enter canned, condensed, pasteurized milk. It's not an overstatement to say that this changed Hong Kong's tea drinking culture forever. Because suddenly, high-quality milk from Europe or America could be transported across oceans and stored on shelves across the British Empire for months, if not years, safely. And that is how condensed or evaporated milk not only defined a whole new style of Hong Kong milk tea with even creamier, luscious results. It finally made milk tea affordable and popular among locals. And so post-World War II, when Hong Kong's population truly started to explode, this super strong black tea brewed in pantyhose-like filters, sweetened with lots of sugar and enriched with now tons of widely available rich milk, firmly established itself as a favorite energy-rich beverage for the working masses. It was not the light milk tea enjoyed in Britain, and most certainly a far cry from traditional Chinese tea. The people of Hong Kong started looking at this unique beverage as part of their newly forming distinct identity. And that lasts to this day, with Hong Kong milk tea being enshrined as one of only 3 food items with cultural heritage status by the local government. But wait, why are we talking about Hong Kong milk tea in the mid-20th century when bubble tea, the topic of this video, was born much later in Taiwan? Well, patience, my friend. All the pieces of this frothy puzzle are about to fall into place. Alright, so Taiwan, which during the 19th century was a province of China, had always maintained a somewhat distinct identity. One of its most important influences was Hokkien culture, which might ring a bell with you now. Remember those Hokkien merchants I mentioned earlier? You know, the ones that introduced tapioca pearls to China back in the day? Well, they certainly didn't overlook Taiwan. The island had long been famous for a traditional snack called fenyuan, small pearls of tapioca or sweet potato starch mixed with syrup and ice-cold water. It was a perfect remedy for Taiwan's hot summers, but even more crucially, it was very cheap. And that affordability was much needed. You see, in the late 1940s, after Mao Zedong and his Communist Party won the Chinese Civil War, 2 million refugees fled from all over China to the small island of Taiwan, almost doubling its population. So after decades of first Japanese colonial rule, then civil war, and now this abrupt surge in population, Taiwan was confronted with a grim truth. It was anything but a rich country. But we are gonna fast forward to the 1980s, where things had changed quite a bit. Through decades of hard work, Taiwan had against all odds become one of the 4 Asian tigers, which means Asian countries with rapid industrialization and very high economic growth. A lot of Taiwanese people now had a little bit of spare money in their pockets, and they started embracing a new trend. And that was food. Not just food to survive, but food for leisure and fun. I guess the thing we call foodie culture these days. Taiwan has these night markets, for example, which today are a signature feature of the country, and they evolved from vendors selling rubber boots and fortune telling to literally food paradises. A real obsession with snacks and food innovation was starting to take over the island. But while Taiwan's food scene was undergoing this massive transformation, its entertainment sector, it wasn't quite there yet. Looking to their neighbors for some much needed distraction and amusement, the people of Taiwan quickly started falling in love with the pop culture of Hong Kong, with its catchy canto pop and legendary movie industry, of course. And with this cultural exchange came an interest in the quintessential Hong Kong drink. You guessed it, milk tea. But to be fair, milk tea wasn't entirely new to Taiwan. Inspired by Japanese taverns called izakayas and also Hong Kong's milk tea trend, a cocktail of condensed milk and tea, shaken until frothy and served in a cocktail glass, had been around Taiwan since probably around the late 1940s. But this drink, known as shouyao, which means something like the handshaken, was slowly evolving from a luxury reserved for the rich to a commodity. And so thanks to Taiwan's economic boom and the people's newly found interest in novelty foods, more and more tea shops started offering milky shouyao to curious customers. Remember that lawsuit I mentioned at the top of the video? This is where we start getting closer to the 2 battling tea houses again. It was actually a trip to Japan where iced coffee was all the rage that inspired the owner of Chun Shui Tang, one of the 2 battling tea houses and back then just a tiny little tea shop, to experiment with iced shouyao, iced shaken tea. I guess in 1980s Taiwan, that must have blown people's minds. Because this new take on tea, which was only ever drunk hot before that, I suppose, it was a hit, but it was about to be eclipsed by what followed after. Do you remember fenyuan, that sweet, icy dessert with chewy tapioca pearls? You know, the one that had been a thing in Taiwan for ages? Well, one day in the late 1980s, just for fun, a certain Mrs. Lin, an employee of Chun Shui Tang Tea House, decided to take her leftover fenyuan from lunch and add those to a cup of shouyao milk tea during one of their staff meetings. Everyone present gave it a try and decided unanimously that this was a lot more interesting and delicious than they would ever have thought. So they decided, hey, why not just put this on the menu and see how things go? And I think 30 years later, we know how things went. But roughly around the same time and just a few cities away, a certain Mr. Tu, who also owned a tea house, claims that he had a moment of inspiration where he decided to take the widely available tapioca pearls fenyuan and add them to some green tea. He even claims that he had put his creation, which by the way had no milk in the tea, on his menu a year before Chun Shui Tang did. And that is what the big Taiwanese lawsuit was about. To figure out who came up with this first, with virtually no reliable way to actually put a specific date on either story. But guys, you have some context now. When you consider the rich century-long history of drinking tea and enjoying jelly-like desserts. When you think about the rise of Hong Kong milk tea, the economic miracle and following food food innovation wave in 1980s Taiwan. The birth of bubble tea as we know it today isn't really about who combined these three ingredients in a cup first. It's much more about understanding the anatomy of a trend, understanding why Taiwan of all places was such fertile ground for this new bubble tea hype to arise and flourish. Bubble tea wasn't merely created on a whim as a marketing stunt. Its creation was nothing short of inevitable. I'm gonna say it was destiny. And that is the true story of bubble tea.